which I entitled Your Paths Drip with Rich Abundance. This morning, I'm going to change it up a little bit by starting with a poem by the English poet William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, which is his critique of living in a materialistic time in which nature is not appreciated, but seen only through the eyes of a commodity. And I do so because Psalm 65 is a psalm of contrasts, contrast between silence and speech, noise and song, Zion and the expansiveness of the world, justice and natural abundance, the national and the personal. So Psalm 65 in 14 verses has a lot of contrasts, but at its core, it's a celebration of God's creation. And in that regard, there's a universal dimension because God's the creator of all. And to underscore what's distinctive about Psalms is that Psalms have, first and foremost, God as the audience. And in that sense, they come to God from a perspective of gratitude and celebration. And in that light, let me first read William Wordsworth's poem, a sonnet, "The world is too much with us." The world is too much with us late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lay, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. And I'll add that the Greek god Triton, the old mythological figure, is the god who can soothe the howling sea waves. Because that image, Psalms coming, of course, much before Wordsworth, speak of God stilling the sounds of the ocean. And there too, I opened with the Wordsworth poem to say that what the psalmist brings is an openness of his imagination, not just his senses, to the sounds of the ocean, of a storm, that those in a certain religious mindset are a symphony of God, that God ultimately has power as well to silence. And so let me begin reading Psalm 65. I'm going to pace it because, again, I have a book that I want to read from by Norman Fisher, who's a teacher of Zen Buddhism, who's translated many of the Psalms and through a Zen perspective. But first, let's start with with our sacred text, Psalm 65. Your paths drip with rich abundance. For the conductor, a psalm for David, a song. For you, silence is praise, God in Zion, and to you is paid a vow. Hearer of prayer, to you all flesh will come. Matters of wrongdoing overwhelm me. Our crimes, you forgive them. Happy is whom you choose to draw near to dwell in your courtyards. May we be sated with the goodness of your house, holiness of your sanctuary. With wondrous works of justice, answer us, God of our deliverance, confidence of all the ends of the earth and the far-flung sea, who sets mountains with strength, girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the uproar of nations. And in awe of your signs are dwellers at the ends. From the outgoings of the morning and evening, you make them rejoice. You remember the earth and water her, greatly enriching her with the stream of God that is full of water. You prepare their grain, for surely you set it, saturating her furrows, smoothing her ridges, softening with showers her growth. You bless. You crown the year with your goodness, and your paths drip with rich abundance. They drip unto oases of the desert, and with joy are the hills enwrapped. Meadows are clothed with flocks, and valleys are covered with grain. They shout for joy, yes, they sing. And so a little bit of an analysis, and again, I'll keep an eye on the clock. There is no sense here in the opening of a historic moment per se. A later commentator, the Malbim, who lived in Russia in the 19th century and wrote an entire commentary to all of Tanakh, he will suggest that this is related to the end of a 3-year drought that is described during the life of David in the second book of Samuel 21. But most rabbis in the classic commentaries see this as an allegory for the future Messianic era. So Meiri, who lived in Catalonia 1249 to 1315, he'll say that this is an allegory of a messianic time of spiritual and material bounty. Classic commentators will often give David prophetic powers. So here it's for David, but what is distinctive is it's called a shir, a song. And the classic commentators will say that a mizmor is instrumental and a shir is a cappella, so that it's sung, if you will, by chorus. Now, the way that this is divided is verses 2 to 5 is one of 3 units. This first unit, 2 to 5, describes prayers in the temple. Again, with this contrast between God being in Zion, God being in God's house, sanctuary, courtyards. And you can see this, as is also suggested, as written perhaps by a priest. They're the ones with the Levites who in the courtyard would sing to the pilgrims, who would provide the song to create a religious experience that would have given context for composition. And so the first stanza is temple prayers. Verses 6 to 9, the next unit, is a description of the majesty of creation. And I will add that the last verse of each of these sections, so verse 5 of the first section is a summary. Likewise, verse 9 is the summary of God's signs and wonders. I will point out that verse 5, just so I don't lose it in my summary, the Zohar will point to and say there are 10 words in verse 5, and these 10 words represent God's protective 10 canopies that are provided at a place of Brit Milah, of circumcision. So verse 5, as a result of that comment in the Zohar, will thereafter, and again, the Zohar gets first brought to light in about the year 1300 in Spain, will become in time an integral part of a Brit Milah ceremony. Happy is whom you choose to draw near to dwell in your courtyards. May we be sated with the goodness of your house, holiness of your sanctuary. Well, back to the structure. Second section is verses 6 to 9, and they're actually constructed as a chiasm, ABBA. So, with wondrous works, God sets mountains, then B, stills the roaring of the sea, and then back to the general in 9, awe of your signs. And then the last section is verses 10 through 13 or through 14, and that's a shift from the overall majesty of creation to more specifically the power of rain and water, if you will, to enable the bounty of the earth. It's taking the regularity of creation and focusing it in specifically on God as provider of the necessary ingredient of water that allows the world to flourish, and does so with, if you will, let's look at the last verse as an example, verse 14, which is the summary in some ways of this stanza, but of the whole psalm, which is focused on God's bounty. And as I now read to you Psalm 14, I invite you, as the classic rabbis did, both to see the colors and to hear the sounds. So verse 14, meadows are clothed with flocks. The valleys are covered with grain. They shout for joy. Yes, they sing. So meadows, green, are clothed with flocks. That's white. Valleys are covered with grain. You can see the green again, but with the waving of the yellow stalks. That's the color image. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, that important commentator of Spain, actually he's of France, Narbonne, France, 1160 to 1235, he will say of the image, the shouts for joy, for him is the sound of the grain rustling in the wind. So again, a poetic sensibility, back to Wordsworth, in which nature is alive, that it's not a commodity to be bought or sold. It's an experience, and more so for the psalmist, an experience in which behind the colors and the sounds is the controlling goodness of God. But back to the contrast that I opened with, I'll start again. It begins with Lecha Dumiyah, for you silence, Tehillah Elohim, is praise God. And so this image is a religious image that for me to say all that would be worthy, I can't do, because words can't contain all I would want to say. Martin Cohen, in his analysis of this image, says if you try to describe the taste of a lemon or the beauty of a sunset, at some point you're aware that the sensuality of an experience cannot be fully contained in words, because it involves far more than words can contain. And so in wisdom literature, I once heard that so begins the I Ching, there are no words and then the words flow to describe the world. And so here to describe God and to describe God's majesty, the focus of this psalm, it begins with, "For you silence is praise." And that will be echoed in other ways later on. One other free association to silence, and that's, of course, Aaron after his sons are killed bringing an offering. We saw that a couple of days ago in a psalm, a reference to domam, silence. So again, there are times in which words are inadequate. And yet, back to contrast, God, who is beyond description, is now concretized by being identified with a particular place, namely Zion, and a particularly way of relating to God, which is the promise of sacrifices, vows. This again is the language of the priest, probably the author. God is the hearer of prayer, and there's a personal dimension as it opens, a constant referring to God in the second person as you who forgive. And it's not clear in verse 4 if the forgiveness is for something he did, that he feels on some level tainted. He sees it as our crimes, the nature of the human condition, or if it's about a particular foe. It's really in the background, but what's the contrast is the God who is of a bounty of forgiveness as the God who is the bounty of a world of greenery and harvest. And so again, there's the summary. Happy is whom you choose to draw near to dwell in your courtyards. May we be sated with the goodness of your house, holiness of your sanctuary. And now again, a contrast between verse 3, hearer of prayer, to you all flesh will come, universal God. You're the creator of all. Isaiah will say in 56:7, my house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples. So God here is simultaneously a universal God and yet a God of the house of Zion, of a particular people and a particular place, a tension. And now the second set, the majesty of creation, with wondrous works of justice. So it begins with justice. Again, this kind of commingling of God as moral agent and creator. Confidence of all the ends of the earth and the far-flung seas. So there's a quality of expansiveness that's the contrast to the God of Zion. This God of nature who sets mountains with strength, girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, back to Triton, the roaring of their waves and the uproar of nations. And again, a bit of a wordplay, but you hear it in Hebrew. Sha'on is roaring, and Hamon, Sha'on and Hamon, which I saw in a translation as uproar, and like that, roar and uproar, because be it the human or the expanse of creation, there's a sense of sound. But here too, a contrast between first silence and then praise, and now you get uproar, which means noise that will become transformed into song. And so this next stanza, again, is the majesty of creation. And then the last part, you get the watering. Verse 10. I will add that I like to count sometimes, as you know, what is the middle verse or middle phrase. And for me, if you take off again the introductory and you take out the sellas, the middle words are the uproar of nations, Hamon le'umim in Hebrew. That's the middle. So that this is about Again, this sense of noise, of sound, natural and physical, universal, and yet simultaneously in the context of the individual, of the priest. And so the end is a celebration of the water. And in fact, is the celebration of water. And again, put in the back of your mind that water is also a metaphor for the rabbis of the flow of knowledge, the flow of Torah, as it says in Proverbs. And so when we read here about the water, know that for the classic commentators, all of this is a metaphor for a messianic era in which there'll be a flow of abundance spiritually and materially. All needs will be met. You remember the earth and water her, greatly enriching her with the stream of God that is full of water. You prepare their grain, for surely you set it. Ki chen techineha is also understood by Radak as it is according to your plan. Saturating, verse 11, her furrows, smoothing her ridges, softening with showers her growth, you bless. Again, acknowledging God's active engagement with the enabling of abundance. You crown the year with your goodness. And here you get this beginning of an image of this anthropomorphic dimension in which nature has clothing, has a crown in time, so that all of God's creation has this human-like dimension. You crown the year with your goodness, and your paths drip with rich abundance. They drip unto oases of the desert, and joy are the hills enwrapped. Meadows are clothed with flocks, and valleys are covered with grain, and shout for joy. Yes, they sing. A closing metaphor, and again, I'm pacing myself to read to you another translation, and that is the 3 words to the end in Hebrew, which I translate as shout for joy. That's related to teruah, like the sound of the shofar, which is understood as a proclamation of God's glory, a shout for joy. But Steinsaltz, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, sees another root, and that's ro'eh, a friend, that they will become friends and sing. Back to a kind of a messianic image of how at the end of days, all peoples will be united in friendship, yitro'a'u, enwrapped in friendship is how he translates it. It also has the root, for some commentators, of ro'eh, which is a shepherd, and that everybody will be gathered together. And so I want to do something different, and that's one more translation before I open it up. I've had the privilege to meet Norman Fischer. He is a Zen practitioner, born Jewish, but became the head of the Zen Center in the San Francisco area. And his best friend, my friend, was Rabbi Alan Lew, who was also a Zen practitioner before he went to rabbinical school. And in the back of, this is a collection of 97 Psalms translated through a Zen perspective by Norman Fischer. So I could say a lot more about Norman, but I'm mindful of the time. Psalm 65 with Norman's translation. And I'm going to take off the text so that you just kind of listen for how he experiences Psalm 65. For you praise waits in Zion, vows pile up to be paid. All that lives readies to advance to you who hears these words. I am weary of the world's crookedness and my own confusions. You will straighten and correct it with forgiveness, wiping woes away. Happy are those you choose who approach you and dwell in your house, who are satisfied with that happiness, the holiness of your house. Terrific deeds of rightness are your answer to our words. You who are the confidence of rock and sea, the faithfulness of mountains, their might and majesty, who guides the roaring of the seas, the pounding of the towering waves, the tumultuous fortunes of nations. Those who dwell in the outermost lands are awed by your daily wonders, the dawning of the morning and the fading of the evening. They rejoice in as your body's calling. Your thought of earth is the gathering of her waters, the enriching of her soils. Your brook runs with water. And so you prepare the harvest that feeds life, saturating her furrows, smoothing her ridges, softening her with showers, murmuring the blessings of her growing. Your crown is the ample unfolding of the years, your body, the presence in physical places. The pastures of the wilderness distill it, the hills of the settlements disperse its joy. The meadows are clothed with flocks, the valleys mantled with grain. The people give voice to it with words. They murmur it, shout it, sing it out. So that's a beautiful, inspired, personalized reading of Psalm 65. I'll add, in terms of Norman Fisher, he writes at the back of the book that he was inspired to translate the Psalms after spending a week at a Trappist monastery in Kentucky. And their chanting of Psalms moved him to go back to wish to explore his own Jewish roots and connection to Psalms. And then in the acknowledgments, we'll acknowledge his, what he calls his oldest friend, Alan Liu, who was he calls him my closest friend, with whom I have walked the path side by side for 30 years and more. And Alan Liu was the rabbi near Golden Gate Park in San Francisco throughout most of his career, and was a classmate and a remarkable man. So with that, let me gain, as we're close to 10, some of your thoughts or reactions to Psalm 65, which I have entitled, Your Paths Drip with Rich Abundance. Arnold, and then Alex.
A couple of quick thoughts. In verse 2, this idea of silence.
Yes.
I don't think it necessarily means the absence of words, but it could mean contemplation, which is contemplating God, and words are involved, but they're internalized. And anyway, it's so that was what struck me with the word silence.
So let me give you a riff in that regard, Arnold. Moses Maimonides, Rambam, Spain to Egypt, 1135 to 1204, writes the Encyclopedia of Jewish Law, the Mishneh Torah, in which he says regarding sacrifices, that sacrifices were a necessary vehicle for people who lived in a time in which everybody worshiped God by bringing presents. And he adds it was a concession to the Jews leaving Egypt because that's the only way they had seen worship, is through sacrifices. But he adds, it would be like somebody saying to us, praise God, but don't use words, suggesting that to be in the presence of God without words was even a higher quality of communion, of praise, of worship than words. He suggested that words too, not unlike sacrifices of old, are a vehicle that is limited by a cultural need and provided because of a cultural need. So that's just a building on your insight, Arnold, that silence doesn't mean nothingness. It means that that's a quality of worship. Alex, you have to unmute. There you go.
looking at verse 4, Divrei Onu, uh, could it not also be translated of wrongful words have overwhelmed me? And,
Yes. Keep going. The answer is yes, but keep going.
and what the psalmist is talking about at this moment is that I can't speak. I can't speak. Wrongful words of overwhelm me. I
Yeah.
can only act. I could fulfill a vow. I could, you could I could come into your courtyards, but I
Yeah.
can't speak. I can only worship you in silence.
So that's possible. And to give support to Alex's suggestion, first to know in Hebrew that the word devar, dibur, can either be a word or an act or a object. So that's to say, how that gets played out is that words have physical impact. They are like things. They're not just air. And the choice of verse 4 can either be matters of wrongdoing or words of wrongdoing. If it was words, then it's linked to verses 2 and 3, because verses 2 and 3 deal with silence and hearing. But the second half of verse 4 deals with crimes, which is, and the verse 5 deals with bringing offerings on some level in terms of drawing near. The karev, the third word in verse 5, is to draw near, is the same root as karban, an offering or a sacrifice. And so what's really poetically sophisticated is to say that this comes right as a turning point where it can either be words linking to what came before, or it can be matters, acts, which would link to what comes after. And in that sense is a bit of a hinge. And I continue to marvel and value these hinge points or these double entendres that are built into the artistry of a well-crafted poem to God.
See also,
Hal?
there's a contrast and continuity with the previous psalm yesterday, where words are hateful arrows who are deadly in the mouths of liars, and here in the contrast of the beauty of silence.
That was a question that I think Richard had asked a couple sessions ago about how are the Psalms organized? Yes. Is there a flow to them? And it's that the rabbis clearly had a choice of how this is actually before the rabbis, in terms of when the Bible got put together. The word rabbi is only appearing in the 1st century before the Common Era, and Psalms is put together probably 700 in terms of the editing process before the Common Era, 6th, 7th century. But in some, there is an order, and I like that emphasis that Hal has made between Psalm 64 about words as weapons and Psalm 65 in terms of there are ultimately no words on the positive side to describe God, and yet there's this kind of spiritual paradox where then the words flow and begin because of a human need to put into words our experiences. And we do so, which is the nature of prayer, both because to put a powerful experience into words helps give it a container to the experience, to look at the experience, to own an experience, and later to evoke that experience by rereading.
Can I share an image?
Yes. Who's Sarah? Go ahead, Sarah.
The whole image, the the image that I get, the image that I get is of waves crashing on the beach, where you have the roar of the water crashing on the beach, and then there's a little brief second in time where it's silent, and then there's the uproar where the water goes back out. So to me, the silence is in that image between the going in and the going out, and the roar and the uproar.
So what I like about your focusing again, that's on verse 8. And again, some of the rabbis, you have some of that in verse 14 as well, which is to hear in the flow of natural sounds a melody, a song. And we all know that in any musical composition, it's the silences between notes that gives a distinctive feel to how a composition is played. And so silence is the pacing of, and clearly that is, the roaring of the seas, the roaring of the waves, and the uproar of nations has that element of silence between the sounds of the waves. I'll also just underscore again in verse 8, this commingling, though, of the sounds of the ocean with the sounds of the nations. And again, that's what's distinctive about Psalms. Now I'm pulling it together, is that Psalms are written to God, who's the creator in the mindset of the religious monotheist. And God as creator has these paradoxes of being in a place of worship and transcending any place, of being worshiped with words and ultimately beyond all words, and praise being in silence. God who is concerned about justice, a moral presence in the world, who forgives wrongdoing as part of a moral process. Because if there is no forgiveness, then there's no possibility of change. And clearly, an aspect of morality is the potential of repentance. And that quality of God's power is, again, mixed paradoxically with this God who is the God who has a plan for creation. Ki chen techineha, at the end of verse 10, you have created this magnificent flow. And there's the image of the ends of the earth appreciating expansiveness, but the rising and falling of the sun from one end of the world to the other with a quality of regularity, that the power of God's creation is a kindness grounded in predictability and trustworthiness. All of that, all those contrasting dimensions of what it means for the psalmist, probably a priest, to worship God, ultimately leads to there are no words. And so it is a magnificent poem, Psalm 65 of celebration. In terms of coming attractions, before we do Kaddish, I already did my research, at least, on Psalm 66 for next Tuesday. Because of Thanksgiving, we'll meet on Tuesday and Wednesday, and not on Thursday. Psalm 66, you have refined us as if refining silver, which will raise a theological question. And that is there such a thing as, in Hebrew, it's called Yisurim Shel Ahava, the pains of love. Did God choose suffering for the Israelites to purify us? Or is that simply a byproduct of life itself? So that's a theme that is distinct to Psalm 66. You have refined us as if refining silver, in a psalm that is focused, rather than on the messianic future, more focused on the nature of being a dispersed people. So that's for next week. I invite anyone who would like to honor a loved one with Kaddish to join in reciting of those words with me. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah
Amen.
bi'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon u'vyomechon u'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi
Shmei
Abba mevarach le'olam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei b'kudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran b'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi Lama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom B'mamav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen. Thanks to each of you for participating. I will look to see you next week. In the interim, blessings of Shabbat Shalom.